Good evening and welcome to Live at 9. Today is Wednesday the 26th of January 2011. I'm your host Simon Barrett. I have an extremely interesting guest tonight, Don McAlvany, who's a political and financial commentator from the United States. And today's program will really look at the whole issue is America in crisis? And if the light goes out in America, then the light goes out in the rest of the world. What's happening not only to the American economy, which affects the world economy, but also what's more important, what's happening politically with the United States. And also that will give us an understanding about what's happening in the world, so we're more informed, we're more alert about the dangers that are coming in the next coming months and coming years that enable us to pray and understand the times of the season. Don, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on Live at 9 tonight. And, you know, we had, I think, went for a meal, courtesy of Richard Kent, which was very nice. But, I mean, it's very rare that I get the opportunity to speak to someone who knows so much about the American political system, what's happening in the United States. And to me, it's really refreshing. I can bounce ideas off. So hopefully, you know, the program will reflect that. Now, I know that you've been on, I know that Doug has interviewed you, and I know that Gordon has as well, and they're very much focused on the world economy and the US economy, but also want to bring in the politics. But for the viewers who don't know you, can you say how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ?
I was at the University of Texas. I got involved in some heavy political activity, saw a lot of communist things going on, ended up doing some undercover work for some intelligence agencies, and really began to see the world as a very different place than most of the people I knew saw it. And I think it was out of that I began to ask a lot of searching questions. And so when I was 23 years old, I gave my heart to Jesus Christ and was born again. And but have been very involved in the political realm and the financial realm ever since, and how they all interface with the spiritual realm. Look, I see the world as a three-sided triangle. You've got the monetary economic decline of the West and America, and that's because of a lot of things we could talk about, and I talk and write about. Then you've got the social political decline, which is as we in the West are moving into socialism, some areas Marxism and so forth. And then the bottom of the triangle is the spiritual moral decline. And so I begin to kind of study in all three of these areas and realize that they're inseparable. And so we find that we do see America in crisis today, Simon.
Yeah. I mean, just you're an expert in international finance, economics. You had a career working in Wall Street. How was what was it like to work in that environment in Wall Street, and how much is understanding the economic structures of the American economy gave you insight into the political realm within the United States?
Working on Wall Street, Simon, taught me that nothing is what it appears to be. There's a tremendous amount of deception and disinformation in our financial system in America. And I saw this 35, 40 years ago, so it didn't just start. It's much worse today. And so there is a lot of corruption in our financial system on Wall Street. Wall Street is very involved with our Federal Reserve, with the Treasury, with many people in our U.S. Congress. Actually, I think after a few years on Wall Street, I became very disillusioned that the world was not run by the same people I thought it was run by, that in fact there was an awful lot of self-dealing and greed and outright dishonesty. I saw that 35, 40 years ago. It's probably 100 times worse today, and that has led us to the financial crisis, which is also helping to ignite a political crisis in America.
Yeah. We have a 5-minute clip now that will just bring this whole issue into focus.
This was the life. They had arrived. Business was booming. There were deals to be had. Everybody who was anybody was there. There was the new rich, the old rich, and of course the stars were there. A lot of new somebodies were there. They were dancing their nights away as if there were no tomorrows. At least, none worth worrying about.
But there was one tomorrow fated to come, which would change everyone's destiny. Early Tuesday morning, October 29th, 1929, the stock market opened just as it had for the last 20 years. The trading floor was a frenzy of activity, except on this day, all the trade orders were to sell, not buy. But not even the experts suspected the devastating crash that would become known as the Great Depression. Not only did it dramatically change the lives of all Americans, but it affected the lives of millions more around the world. Once prominent traders and wealthy businessmen jumped to their deaths from multi-story buildings. Hard-working people lost their life savings, businesses, homes, and jobs. Thousands of millionaires became mere statistics in the fast-growing ranks of the unemployed. The middle class virtually disappeared. By the end of the year, the market lost the unbelievable sum of $40 billion in equity. 3 years later, at the depth of the Depression, the national income fell by 50%. 5,000 banks closed their doors. The degree of universal pain and suffering prompted President Franklin Roosevelt to take action which would once have been considered illegal. The Founding Fathers had been firm on the fact that the government was never to interfere with the free enterprise system. But Roosevelt boldly initiated his New Deal, and for the first time in U.S. history, the government provided help, called entitlements, for the needy. The stage was set for the federal government to dominate American business, banking, commerce, and the economy as a whole. It was the promise of acquiring prosperity built on borrowing without the ability to repay, which had tempted normally conservative Americans to risk all they owned before the crash. In 1928, there was no venture too risky to invest in. There had been a few prophetic voices that warned of impending financial disaster because of the accumulated debt, yet their words were dismissed as just so much gloom and doom. This was America. This was the strongest nation on earth. Ironically, the cure for the Depression was built on another kind of debt, much broader in scope: government debt. Little did President Roosevelt and subsequent politicians who followed suit know it would incur such crippling and long-range consequences. Consequences which would be more devastating to the nation than the Great Depression itself. Today, the Great Depression is simply a painful memory for those who survived it, and perhaps a matter of historical interest. The Dow Jones Industrial Average makes the news every day, and the stocks rise and fall as usual. But as America begins its entry into the 21st century, could it be that it is once again on the verge of another Great Depression? This time one that would plummet the world's greatest power to the status of a poverty-stricken nation.
Thousands of angry depositors mobbed Security Federal today as their doors closed for the last time. Security Federal is the 97th bank to collapse since last Thursday's stock market crash. The FDIC has announced it will not be able to insure any of the accounts. Bank President
55,000 employees lost their jobs today as Microtech, one of the few remaining American-owned manufacturing companies, sold out to a Japanese firm. The Natsuki Corporation announced it would immediately relocate the production facilities to Mexico City. The announcement came as a shock to employees.
Estimates of damages from Hurricane Franco, which swept through Florida's midsection last week, have reached a record high of $65 billion. For the first time in U.S. history, government aid will not be available due to the severe economic
The death toll has soared to over 600 as rioting continues to escalate in the nation's 3 largest cities. Law enforcement agencies in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago have been unable to gain control, citing severe government cutbacks as the cause.
Welcome back to Live at 9. What's so interesting about that clip, Don, that it was produced prior to 2000, so it's over 10 years old, and it almost has a very much a prophetic ring to it, as if that has almost become a fulfillment of prophecy. I mean, we lived through the last decade borrowing far beyond our means. Governments were borrowing far beyond their means, and then in 2007 we had what was essentially an economic earthquake with the collapse of the Lehman Brothers Bank and the whole financial crisis. Firstly, we still feels like we're living through the consequences of the collapse on the banks and too much greed. But can you explain what led up to the collapse of the bank, and are we out of the economic danger really?
What happened in the 1920s has been repeated in the last 10 to 15 years in America, but 100 times greater, with far greater debt, far greater leverage, far greater speculation than anything that was ever imagined in the 1920s that led to the crash and the Great Depression. We have seen real estate drop, Simon, in the last 3.5 years, $9 trillion. This is residential real estate only, $1.7 trillion last year alone. Now, the stock market has been propped up of late. If you go back to the early 2000s, about 8 or 9 years ago, we had about a 2.5-year period where the stock market dropped $8 trillion. Then the government decided to come in, and this is one thing we need to understand. We saw this with the New Deal. With Roosevelt's New Deal, we're seeing it again. Governments in general, socialists in particular, love crises because crises give them a chance for crisis management. Crisis management means new controls, new programs, new spending, new debt, and so forth. And so we saw this quantum leap into socialism with the New Deal under the crisis of the Great Depression, and now we're seeing the same thing in the United States. This time we're seeing our Federal Reserve, our central bank, and our government run the printing presses like they've never done in the history of the United States. In the last 3.5 years, they've created $4 trillion out of thin air. Now you say, well, is that benefiting the American public? No, it's not going to the American public. It's going to the big banks. The big banks who speculated and created the credit default derivatives bubble, which collapsed about 3.5 to 4 years ago, which spread ripples all across the world. And so the people who created that, profited from it, have now been rewarded with all of this bailout money. So when you see quantitative easing and all these programs that are supposed to set the ship of state aright, what they are is gigantic printing press programs to bail out the big banks in America, to bail out Wall Street. And what we are in America today is the early stages of a second Great Depression, which in my opinion will be at least as bad, maybe worse than the Depression of the 1930s. Unemployment is approaching the levels of the 1930s. Our government says unemployment is 9.4%. All economic statistics in America are distorted, they are manipulated, and they are false. The real world unemployment in the United States is 22.4% by simply going back and counting people the way we did 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, we see many areas of the United States that indicate that we are already in a depression, even as Wall Street and the financial media and the government keep telling us we're in a great new recovery. We are not in a recovery. We are in a depression.
If you really take back and see what's happening in Britain as well, I mean, we had the collapse of Northern Rock, that could have triggered a whole complete collapse of our banking system here, with so much money invested in our banks. We've had the government bail out billions and billions of pounds to bail out the banking industry. And what becomes apparent now is there's no money left. So we have a coalition government, Conservatives and Lib Democrats, who are massively cutting back on public spending in order to reduce the budget deficit because of the interest, fearing that what happened in Europe, for example, the collapse of the Greek economy and also the Irish economy could happen here in Britain. If there is another crisis with the banks, what is going to be the economic state of the world? Because there's no money left to keep the banking system afloat.
Well, on the surface, things look very deflationary. We had a deflationary depression in the 1930s. Debt was collapsing by the billions and billions, by the hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's what it looks like all over the world. You see the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. You see the implosion of real estate and the credit default derivatives and so forth. Now, there's something even scarier than the deflationary depression of the 1930s. And that's the politicians and the monetary authorities beginning to run the printing presses at Mach 10 speed in order to try to stop the depression. And overnight, you go from a deflationary depression to an inflationary depression to a hyperinflation as people begin to understand what they're doing, just as they did in Weimar Germany, 1919 to 1923, when they were trying to make their war reparations after the Treaty of Versailles.
Yes, yes.
They ran the printing presses, and they got away with it for a while, and then all of a sudden people abroad who were owning German marks, these Deutschmarks, they said, wow, we don't want to be, look what they're doing with their printing presses, and so they all began to dump it, and then the people in Germany began to dump it, and you had overnight, you had a hyperinflation that totally destroyed the currency. Our nightmare scenario in America is that we have got, our government and our central bank are doing very different than yours. Yours are trying to move into austerity, and it's going to be very, very painful. Ours is going exactly the opposite direction. They're running the printing presses faster and faster. $4 trillion out of thin air, their so-called quantitative easing. Now as people are dumping U.S. Treasury bonds and bills from around the world, including China, guess who's buying them? Our Federal Reserve is buying them. What are they buying them with? $600 billion. They call it quantitative easing. It's just printing press money that they've just created in recent months. So we're seeing our government explode the money supply, and the potential for an inflationary depression morphing into a hyperinflation is really great. And then on the heels of that, you've got socialist politicians who say, well, the only way we can solve this is to put more controls on everything. And so in the midst of this financial crisis, America is plunging into socialism. So we have got multiple crises going on in America that are very, very painful. And Simon, I'm sorry to say, most Americans still don't understand what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, economics is very much a specialized area. But, you know, it's also looking at this whole thing. I mean, are we beginning to see in America? I mean, there's a really interesting article here on the Times on Monday. It's an opinion piece by Tom Montgomery. He says, only another Bush can stop Obama now. Now, he goes in there and he talks about this article about how that if Obama is re-elected for a second year, then the whole political order in America will be totally changed forever, moving away from a phase A economic free market system to almost a communist controlled government system, which would change America forever.
Well, phase one of this started with Obama's first election. Obama is a hardcore socialist and brought socialists in with him. And they have imposed more controls. The socialists that came into the Congress and came into his administration, they put more legislation, more bills, and more regulations were passed in the 2 years that they were in power, the first 2 years, than in the prior 101 Congresses. So the political left came in. I don't think the average American understood how far to the left Obama really would be, and all the people he brought in with him. Now they're fighting to keep control of the White House in the year 2012. If they come in power, they will solidify their power, and America will become a socialist country. We will not recover from this economic crisis that we're in, but that's not the least of our problems. We will lose a great amount of our freedom. Already, they are moving rapidly to dismantle the U.S. Constitution, which has been our great protector of our freedom for all these many years. They are moving very rapidly to dismantle our freedoms, and my concern for America is not just the financial crisis, where the middle class in the United States is being wiped out. Karl Marx would love it. That's what he said, get rid of your middle class. The middle class in America is being wiped out by our present financial crisis, but even as that is happening, we have socialists in power who are taking our freedoms, and America is emerging as a strong, hardcore socialist nation. And if it's not reversed in the year 2012, this thing will move on so fast that I really fear for the future freedom and prosperity of my country. So
it leads to the question, and I've always talked on this one that with Obama, even before he was elected, that we shouldn't look at it, we shouldn't judge him by his rhetoric, we shouldn't judge him by his appearance. And on the one hand, I can see why so many black Americans or African Americans supported him, because in a sense he represented that great hope. that they could aspire to the White House. Another, Martin Luther King, as he was very much advertised and marketed in that fashion. But his politics and those behind him and his cabal of advisors as well, they represent something very, very scary. I mean, we are seeing in America right now, are we not, Don, the erosion of Christian American and that Christianity in the West. Last bastion has been the United States, and we're seeing the erosion of the Judean Christian heritage under the Obama administration. We're also seeing the rise of Islamism in the public square, and also we're seeing Obama take a very, very hostile position towards Israel, which spiritually will mean the decline of the United States as a world superpower as Obama tries to enforce a peace process on Israel. How could the American people have been so blind to elect a leader like Obama?
Well, I think the American people have been dumbed down for the last 30 or 40 years of socialist control in our educational system. The media is controlled by the political left in America, and it has systematically been dumbing down the American people, with the exception of Fox News and certain things on the internet and certain radio outlets and so forth. And so the American people are abysmally ignorant of political, economic type things. They believe pretty much what they hear in the press and the media and so forth. So maybe they have some excuse, some small excuse. What they haven't understood is there's been, Simon, a systematic strategy by the political left over the last 40 to 50 years to take over the major organs of power in America, to infiltrate and take over the spiritual life of America, to foster a homosexual movement, which was actually started by the political left many years ago and is now heavily pushed by our administration. They have basically dominate the media. They dominate the educational system. The political left has been working systematically to take power in America for a half a century or more. And it's been very well thought out, very well strategized. And the good people of America and the conservative and the Christian people of America, they've just been going about their business, not paying any attention to this. And they haven't noticed that someone over about a half a century was quietly stealing their country and their freedom from them. And so we wake up, and finally the ultimate culmination of all this was the election of a far-left government in 2008 under the Obama administration. Now, the average American still hasn't quite figured it out, although there is a growing awakening in America, and we saw this in the recent congressional elections when the Republicans swept the U.S. Congress and could have taken the Senate. And so there is a bit of an awakening taking place in America. There's a grassroots movement called the Tea Party. It has no real leadership. It's just people who are getting angry that they're taking our freedoms, that they're pushing homosexuality. America is a Christian nation, or at least has had a heritage of being a Christian nation. Now we're told we Christians cannot pray in the schools. The Muslims can pray in the schools, but the Christians cannot pray in the schools. The Muslims can do things in public. We cannot. We cannot have things on the sides of buildings, Bible verses anymore, the Ten Commandments. So if it's Judeo-Christian, it's being stripped out of our economy and our culture. And this is not by accident. This was by plan and design. And so there's a growing number of Americans that are deeply concerned about this. And so you see this grassroots Tea Party movement. The political left hate them. They attack them continually and so forth. To give you an idea of the moral decline in America, 40% of the babies born in America now are born to unwed mothers. 40%. That seems to me like a huge number. Nobody even takes notice anymore. There's been a moral, cultural, spiritual decline which has been orchestrated by the political left, and at the same time the Christian church in America has kind of gone to sleep. We've kind of gone to sleep, and we wake up one day and there's this alien force in our White House. They're turning us against Israel. They're turning us against all of our traditional values. And so America's not just in a financial crisis or a political crisis. We're in a cultural crisis. We're in a spiritual crisis. And a lot of it is our faults. We became soft. We became, complacent. We had so much prosperity. But some of this has been very carefully and cleverly orchestrated over about a half a century, and the result is what we see in our government now.
But I mean, going back, talk a little bit more about you know, the political issues a bit later on. But aren't we also seeing with the start of the banking collapse in 2007, and you're describing the state of the American economy, but a huge transfer of economic power and wealth away from the West and more towards the East. The rise of China as an economic power and what have you. So, you know, are they, for example, the Obama administration, are they aware of the policies that they're actually carrying out and the implication of their position and power and influence in the world? Because since the since the end of the Bush administration, and certainly after his first term in office, we've seen a massive decline in American influence and power in the world.
Well, the socialists certainly are wrecking our foreign policy. I think there were mistakes made under the Bush administration, but good grief, nothing compared to what's happening right now. So we are losing credibility all over the world. We're losing credibility because they see our government in our central bank, the Fed, destroying the dollar. And since there's people who hold many, many trillions of these dollars all over the world, that is angering people virtually everywhere. You mentioned something early on in that question. It was kind of several questions together. And what we're seeing is a giant shift, Simon, in world political, financial, economic power from the West to the East. Now, you may remember, and maybe I shouldn't say this sitting here in jolly old England, but there was a day when England and the UK ruled the world. The British Empire was supreme. That was in the 1800s and earlier. But then in the last century, we saw America. America became the dominant power, and most people would say, yeah, America dominated the last century tremendously.
Yes, yes.
But now that is shifting. It's shifting to China, and it's shifting to Asia. And so you see this massive power shift of economic power, financial power, political power, ultimately military power, because the Chinese military is building up very rapidly, and it's pretty scary to think where they'll be in 5 to 10 years. And they've got a lot of U.S. technology, which was transferred to them, the highest technology we had transferred to them under the Clinton administration. And so there's even the gold. Even the gold. I mean, we have told people for years, get into gold. It's kind of a financial port in the storm, et cetera, and, you know, gold and silver have done quite well. But the gold from the West is moving to the East. What happened when Gordon Brown, Chancellor of Exchequer, who was later rewarded by becoming Prime Minister, when he sold a giant amount of Great Britain's gold down in the 250s, right before it marched up to 1429. Where did that gold go to? Most of that gold ended up going into the central banks of Asia. And so what's happening is, with this giant political, financial, economic power shift, even the gold is moving to Asia, and that's historical. Whenever you see a giant shift in power in the world, go back 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years of history, you will see the gold actually goes along with it. So the world, the wave of the future, I'm sorry to say, is Asia. Now, my wife and I spend 6 months a year out in Asia. We have orphans' homes in 3 different countries in Asia, and so we spend a lot of time out there. It is incredible to see what's going on out there. And the bottom line to this is the Western powers, America, the UK, Europe, have become socialist, and Asia is becoming free market. We are the ones that have the massive amount of debt here in the West, in Europe, in the UK, in America. They have far less debt. And so everything is shifting in that direction, and that's a shift which will go on for the rest of most of our lives.
But what implications does that have? I mean, as Christians living in Britain and also the United States as well, surely that will mean, I mean, what kind of society are we going to be living in the next 2 or 3 years? I mean, if there's like you're saying, looking at the economic and the political trends, that power certainly shifted more towards the East, but what is the implications for, say, Britain and the United States and their leadership in the world?
Well, Francis Schaeffer wrote 20 years ago in How Then Shall We Live that we were, at that time, he said, we were in the post-Christian era. Well, certainly 20 years later, there's no doubt about it. America is a post-Christian nation. And I hate to say this, but it seems to me like the UK and Europe are very much in the same boat.
I think we went before you.
So we are, probably. So we are in a post-Christian era where, in fact, the powers that be are very liberal, they're very socialist, they're very atheist, they're very pro-Islamic. And so there's going to be a move against Christianity. I wrote a book 12 years ago. Well, it's not a bestseller, but it's called Storm Warning, the coming persecution of Christians and traditionalists in America. It was during the Clinton years, and there was the beginning of persecution. We see the early signs of it right now in the United States. You will see it in Europe. I think you may see it here. You see talks of Sharia law coming up. In places in the United States, it's being advocated, hasn't been implemented. I hear it's advocated in places in Europe, in the UK, and so forth. You're going to see the West become poorer and poorer. The middle class in America, just as Karl Marx, his great dream was to destroy the middle class. You have this very, very wealthy upper class that controls almost everything, and this massive poor class down here. That's exactly what's happening in America. The middle class, which just lost $9 trillion in real estate, that was their #1 investment holding. The middle class is losing their jobs by the millions every year, even as our government keeps lying and saying no new jobs are being created. No. They're losing their jobs. The middle class is being destroyed, and I think you're going to see this all over the West. So as the East, whether it's India or China or Korea, or as they are becoming more prosperous, we are becoming less prosperous. And then the scariest part of it all is, so we're poor. The scariest part of it all is, as the socialists gain more foothold in the middle of a financial crisis, which they helped to engineer, then they take more and more of our freedoms. And before you know it, in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, I fear we could look a lot more in the West like the old Soviet Union, with command economies, with controls on virtually everything. After 9/11, they passed something called the Patriot Act in the United States. Actually, there's a Patriot I and a Patriot II. Patriot Act was written during the latter part of the Clinton years, and it was implemented within days after the 9/11 disaster. And it basically is a formula for a police state in America. It puts controls on virtually everything in the midst of some kind of a crisis, financial, economic, terrorist crisis, or whatever. And I see these kinds of controls coming in Europe, coming in the UK, where we have very much a surveillance society here, but we have it in America, and so forth. And so my great concern is that we as Americans and we in the West are losing our freedom. We're losing that freedom that we fought many wars and millions of people fought and died for. We're losing our freedom. We're losing our prosperity. That's one thing. That's bad enough. We're losing our spiritual foundation. That's really bad. But we're also losing our freedom. And that's where I see the West headed, and I see that's where I see America headed. And I'm deeply concerned. Now, I'm not the only one. There are other Americans that are concerned, but right now I would say we're in a minority.
So let's go now. We're in 2011, which will start to see a run-up, a build-up to US campaigning, probably in the summertime, to prepare for the 2012 presidential elections. How crucial is this election in 2012 for America, but also for the free world?
I think it's the most critical election in the history of the United States. And I believe that if the political left retains power in the White House, if the political left retains power in America, I believe and I fear that we will lose our freedom, and that the implications for the West are absolutely incredible. You remember, I don't know if you remember, but just in the last month or two, our president said that America no longer has this special relationship with Great Britain that we had for so many years. It's now more with France. Well, I can tell you it's also now more with the Islamic countries. And it's now more with people that are not our traditional friends. And so I have great concern that if the political left retains power, and I believe that there's at least a 50-50 chance that President Obama will be reelected. Our presidents have tremendous power. Number one, the Democrats and the political left have control of the media. So they can certainly influence the media as they did for Obama in the last election. They can do that again, and they will. Okay, but a president can influence many events, and he can give money out to so many different groups and so forth. And our elections are sometimes won and they're sometimes stolen, and they vote many people who are dead. And there's millions and millions of illegals coming across our Mexican border. And believe it or not, many of those people end up voting. They shouldn't. They're not even citizens of the United States. So I have some friends in America that are very complacent after the recent congressional elections. They say, oh, you know, look, Obama's on the run, he's going to lose. I'm not sure at all that he will. But I say this, if America loses the next election And if the people who believe in traditional Christian values of freedom, of morality, and so forth, if they do not regain control in the United States in 2012, and I give them no more than a 50-50 chance, I believe that we will lose our freedom in the United States, and I have grave, grave, grave fears for my own country.
I mean, just looking at one of the, I mean, we look at Obama, and whatever anyone thinks of President Obama, you've got an incredibly radical, intelligent president in power who's probably been able to achieve more than any other Democrat has, a president, in such a short space of time. I'm thinking about Obamacare, for example, nationalizing the health service. Now, according to friends I've got in the States, the reason why there's so much alarm for us, I mean, it's completely alien for us in this country because we have the NHS, and I'm glad that we have that. But in the States, you don't have so much welfare provisions, and the system is more free market. But you know, the introduction of Obamacare, forcing up taxes to pay for this, and most of my American friends are saying, look, we can't afford to pay for this. What situation will that lead America in?
First of all, Obamacare is not primarily about socialized medicine. It certainly is a socialized medicine bill. Forget about calling it the National Health Care Bill. It is a socialized medicine bill. It's not primarily about that. Obamacare has hundreds and hundreds of other provisions. Understand, this was a 2,300-page bill that the senators and the congressmen were not allowed to read before its passage. You say that's sheer insanity. It surely was. But the bill is not just about that. It has socialist controls in hundreds of different areas of our economy. It was a smokescreen to impose massive socialism on the United States of America. The senators and congressmen didn't even know what they had voted for, although a lot of the liberal left ones probably would have supported it. And so basically it's an attack on our Constitution. It's an unconstitutional bill. It's already been declared that by a number of judges. It was an attack on our freedom. It's an attack on so many different things. So it's, yes, it will destroy health care in the United States. That's only part of it. That's only a small part of something else that is absolutely horrendous. And the average American, the average American is very much against it. If you took polls, I mean, virtually everybody, even at the time they were voting for it, was against Obamacare. Obamacare is a socialist boondoggle. And we're hoping it will be repealed by the new Congress. They don't have the votes to do so. We're hoping that they can defund it. We'll see if they have the votes and the courage and the backbone to do that. But basically, it was a gigantic thrust into socialism for the United States.
And also, we have the whole issue in America, which we've had here, something to do with hate speech, and actually by introducing legislation which actually limits what people can actually say. It's almost a kind of a police thought we're having it in this country as well now. Through political correctness gone mad, we can no longer tell the truth, and if we do, we're penalised. Is that also happening in the United States? Is there an attack on freedom of speech? Absolutely.
That's part of the whole thing. In Canada, it is already considered a hate crime if you simply in public, let's say you're a pastor in the pulpit and you read scripture that talks about what God has to say about homosexuality, that's a hate crime and you can be jailed for that. That's very close to passing in the United States. The political left wants to label much of what the conservatives, the people of traditional values and the Christians believe and want to say. They want to label that as a hate crime or hate speech because basically they have got to censor the political right. They've got to censor, there are some conservative talk shows on television and radio in the United States. They have to be closed down. They have to censor them. They have to censor the internet. And one of my great concerns is if there is a state of national emergency, if an economic, financial, terrorist crisis, whatever emerges, and there's a state of national emergency, the Congress has already given the President the power to shut down the internet in the United States. The internet is where millions and millions of people are finding out what is really going on. They're not finding it out from the major television networks, which are controlled by the political left, and so they must censor the internet. So they must shut it down, and one of the major factors, the way they're going to censor things, is through so-called hate crimes or hate speech. And after there was a very awful bombing in Oklahoma City in 1995, and it was blamed on the political right. And they started saying it was because of hate speech and hate thoughts, and they began to attack talk radio and people who had newsletters and so forth. And so that's a thrust of the political left. But behind this whole thing of hate crimes and hate speech is censorship. Yeah. They have to censor the opposition and shut them down. And that's exactly what Adolf Hitler did when the Nazis burned the Reichstag, the German parliament, in 1933, and blamed it on their political opposition. The first thing they did was impose a police state and total censorship. And that's the political left. They haven't done that in the United States, but they would like to do that, and you see more and more initiatives coming out of the political left to try to put that through.
But haven't we begun to see that already? I mean, we had that tragic, and it was a tragic shooting in Arizona, where a deranged, individual took a gun and decided to assassinate a Democratic congressman, happened to be Jewish, and all the blame now has been blamed on the Tea Party movement and Sarah Palin in particular. Is this a trend we're going to see more and more? Because I'm reading that, reading the papers, and it's the State of the Union speech coming up as well. It almost seems that social and political commentators are saying that this has turned Obama administration around, that he's now suddenly out of this crisis, made the speech of his life, and has won. He's gone up by about 5% in the polls.
He's rising in the polls very rapidly. That is true. This happened after the tragedy in Tucson. This happened right after the attempted bombing in Times Square. Almost 6 months or a year ago. Immediately, Mayor Bloomberg said it's the Tea Parties. They're angry. They're angry about they're angry about Obamacare and so forth. Well, within an hour or two, they found it was an Islamic terrorist. It was, who was being supported by other Islamic terrorists. The political left will always attack the political right. No matter who is behind it. They tried to do this during the JFK assassination. They attacked the political left, and they were going crazy. The political left attacked the political right and said it was a right-wing conspiracy. And then finally a radio station that had Oswald on his program six weeks earlier in New Orleans called up and put it out on the news service. No, the man admitted he was a Marxist on our program, and that ended that. So every time there is a crisis, you can expect the political left to attack the conservatives, to try to shut them down. This is their tactic. This is how they will do it. And so we people who love freedom in the West, and we people who are Christians, we need to understand that there is a strategy and there are tactics that are being used. They're being used in the UK. They're being used in Europe. They're being used in the United States, in Canada, in Australia. And we need to become wise, and we need to understand the times. We need to understand these things, and we need to take a stand. We need to take a stand for the traditional principles and values, especially those Christian principles and values that we hold dear. And we also need to take a stand for Israel. Right now, Israel is under attack in the United States from the Obama administration, which is tilted very, very much in favor of the Islamic nations and peoples. And so Israel is coming under attack. Traditional values are under attack. I mean, America's crisis is very, very widespread. If you're a Christian in the UK, please pray for us in America. We need your prayers.
Certainly, we need our own here as well. But one thing I am concerned about with the Obama administration is the fact that as soon as Obama came to power, he took down a portrait of Winston Churchill, which Tony Blair gave to George Bush Jr. During his term stint as president. And also we're seeing a whole, as you alluded to earlier, a whole shift in strategic alignments. I mean, Britain has always stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States, for good or for bad, and particularly in Afghanistan and also in Iraq. And yet Britain is treated with contempt by the administration. But more worrying, and I think more worrying from a spiritual point of view, is the Obama's administration treatment of Israel and the Jewish state. And it's almost treated like complete disdain. And America's closest ally in the United States has always been Israel. And that seems to be a fundamental shift in diplomacy, support of the UN. It's all evaporating. Now, surely that is the warning signal for the United States that America, if it's not careful, is in a collision course with the God of Israel.
Well, there are many people that are concerned in America that when Barry Soetoro changed his name to Barack Hussein Obama, clearly an Islamic name, that told a lot about his sympathies. And since he has been in the White House, his sympathies have tilted very, very sharply in favor of the Islamics, against the Christians in America, very much in favor of the Middle Eastern nations and against the nation state of Israel. And so we are gravely concerned that American foreign policy is being turned against Israel, even as almost every country in the world is beginning to back away and turn against Israel. Now that has almost prophetic, end times type implications, because it says in the Bible that at some time everybody, there will be no friends left. But this is of grave concern to many of us Christians in America, because we believe that if we turn our back on Israel, God may turn his back on America. I believe that part of God's protection over America has been that we have upheld the cause of Jesus Christ in our country. Yes. Even though we were a minority, we have upheld that cause, and we have lived by biblical principles, and we have upheld the cause of Israel. Yeah. And when we start turning back away from those things, then I believe that God's hand of protection over America may be lifted. And that's a deep concern for me and many of our Christian friends in America.
I mean, we talk about this, and we're talking about almost global things really happening to the United States, which has serious implications for the world. I'm a great fan of American history. I love learning about American history. It was part of my degree course during my degree, and I did a Middle East course, but I did a sub-sig course in American history. I just became fascinated with it. And the one thing I liked about it is, in a sense, with America, is what America's done for the world. I know that we've seen a rise of anti-Americanism throughout the past decade to almost epidemic proportions. But, I mean, what other world superpower came in during World War I to help defeat Germany in World War I? If it wasn't for American firepower, that wouldn't have happened. Then in World War II, okay, admittedly you came in late, and we could have done with you a couple of years earlier, right. But you came in. It was that firepower, troops, weapons, technology that helped bring about D-Day and the D-Day landings and the liberation of Europe. Then, with the Marshall Aid Plan, the rebuilding, restructuring of Germany and the whole of Europe, and also Japan, giving them democratic freedoms, and also then protecting us from the Soviet Union. And yet America's been a tremendous force for good in the world over the past decades. Yeah, there are things that are wrong, but any world superpower gets things wrong. But as world policeman, America's given the world back, as well as spreading so many missionaries and around the world, and the spreading of the gospel, and being Israel's greatest supporter and friend. Where's it all gone wrong?
Simon, everything you said is true, and that's why the political left has targeted America. They've targeted our government, our courts, our institutions, our media, our educational system, Hollywood. They know that if they can bring down America, they believe they can basically conquer the world. The political left didn't go away with the alleged fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The communists are stronger than ever around the world. They're stronger than ever in the United States. And the political left have targeted the United States to bring it down to its knees, to turn it into a socialist shadow of what it used to be. And that is what has been happening. And unfortunately, our people have been sleeping through it. The average American has been so dumbed down by a socialist-controlled educational system and media over the last 50 years that the average American is clueless as to what is happening to him. There is a bit of an awakening. Praise God. There's a bit of an awakening taking place in America now. We saw this in this last election. You've seen it with the Tea Party movement and so forth. But the political left has a very successful strategy for bringing our country down. And so there are those of us in America, through my newsletter, through television programs like Glenn Beck on Fox News and so forth, who are trying to wake up the sleeping American giant. Now, when the sleeping American giant wakes up, watch out. Japan made the mistake of attacking us. They made the mistake of attacking us, and they didn't realize that they had just stepped on the tail of the tiger. When the American people rise up and get angry, the American people can be formidable. And this is what I'm hoping, that there will be an awakening amongst the American people that will bring us back. But I don't think that will happen unless we as a people turn back to God first.
Absolutely.
We've forgotten God. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, shortly after he left Russia, he was on BBC television here. I think it was the David Frost program. And they asked him, maybe you remember, and they said, why do you think the Russian people lost their freedom? And he said, because we forgot God.
Amazing.
He spent 25 years in exile in the United States. When he went back from the United States, he was on Russian television. This was back in the 90s, sometime before he passed away in the last few years. And they asked him, how would you, after 25 years in America, how would you portray America? And he said, as a nation that has forgotten God. That's a big problem, and I think he called it right. And so maybe out of the pain of this depression, which is going to get worse and more painful with every day, week, month, and year that passes, maybe out of that pain there will be a great awakening. I'm not sure what it will take to awaken the American people, but we need a great awakening, and we need a great turning back to God. We've had 50 years of uninterrupted prosperity, and that makes people pretty soft, and that sometimes makes Christians kind of forget. And so as a country, we've gotten preoccupied, and we've walked away from the principles, especially the biblical principles that made us a great nation. My prayer is that we will come back to those principles.
It's the same here, though. I mean, we've got it almost, you know, it's mirror reflected. Same things happening in Britain, same things happening in the States. I think we're on a faster process than we are now. But how do we actually get ground back? How, as Christians, can we start to change the ground? I know that we can't do it. As Christians, we can't do it. Only the Lord can do that. Yeah. And it seems that, you know, because of the great Christian heritage and our great Judean Christian heritage, both in Britain and also in the United States, which is interesting because we're the Anglo-Saxon nations, and that God has given us over the last few centuries world leadership. He's given the world leadership into our hands, and now we're throwing it away because we don't understand that the reason why we've given that power in the first place is because God's given us that power in the first place, because to bring about His purposes in the world, to bring about a sense of righteousness, a sense of justice, and a sense of freedom and liberty. And yet this all seems to be eroding now, and we're living in a time of moral confusion, we're living in a time of decadence, and we're also living in an age of fear. And so surely this is what I love about this interview in particular, that this gives us an opportunity to reach out to God and go deeper and deeper and deeper into God and our relationship with Him, and surrender our lives to Him so that He can use our lives for His glory. And if there's enough of us that surrender our lives to the Lord, then there is an opportunity that things can be turned around. Because I believe in my scriptures, I believe that God can do the impossible, and that when righteous people start praying and crying out to God, then God listens, and nations can change overnight.
God is the only one who will turn Great Britain and America around. We have some great examples of Israel who got very far from God. They disobeyed God, and God got angry with them, and He sent judgment against them, and sometimes He sent armies against them and so forth. But there were times when they repented and then they turned back to God. And God restored His blessings on Israel. And we see a number of examples of that in the Old Testament. And I believe that can happen in the UK. I believe that can happen in America. And so the first thing I would say for our listeners is you get on your knees and you start praying for your nation. You pray for this country. You pray for its leaders. And you pray that God will begin to raise up strong Christian leaders. Can He find Gideons out there in the bushes somewhere in Great Britain and in America? Absolutely, He can. Start praying for your nation, and then get involved. Stop sitting back and doing nothing and complaining about what's going on. Get involved. Get involved in the political process. Get involved on a local political basis, and start making your voice heard. There is this spontaneous Tea Party movement in the United States. We'll have to see where it goes, but it has no leadership. It's just a spontaneous movement, and maybe God is behind it, because many of these people are Christians who have said, this is enough. We do not want this evil in our land. We do not want this destruction of our land. And so people are beginning to rise up and speak back in the United States. Will it be enough? I don't know. I don't know if it will or not. but I think we need to pray for your nation. We need to pray for our nation, and then we need to understand the times. We need to be listening to your program and programs like it, reading newsletters like mine and so forth, and then we need to get involved. It's one thing to pray. It's another thing. Way back when, I hate to say it, in the American Revolution, we had pastors who also were warriors. They were fighters. And, you know, this is what we need. We need Christians who are willing to stand up against the evil of our day. To simply close a blind eye to it or say, oh, there's nothing we can do. No, we need Christians that will stand up against the evil of our day, wherever we are. And what have you done? What have all of us done to make a difference in this big leftist juggernaut that we see that's destroying your country and ours? Well, I don't think most of us have done enough. I think there's more we can do. So I would encourage people, get involved. But first of all, get on your knees and start praying every day for your country.
I love your passion, and share your same sentiments as well. And you know, I think it's important that as a lover of freedom, that we have a duty to fight for freedom and liberty. And you know, I believe that we are living in very dark and dangerous times, and fear does stalk our streets. But we believe in Almighty God, and it's that belief that in Jesus, for example, that gives us that hope. I just wondered for some of our viewers who are watching who are not believers, why should they put their faith in Christ?
Jesus Christ is the only answer. He's the only answer for me individually. He's the only answer for your nation and mine as nation states, and He's the only answer for the world. Jesus Christ was the Son of God. He came to this earth 2,000 years ago. He lived 33 years. He died on the cross for us. And the whole world was changed. It wasn't just a handful of people, His followers, that were changed. The whole world was changed because of what Jesus Christ brought into this world. Now, the world is turning away from Jesus Christ right now. It is turning away from the faith of your fathers and our fathers. Yeah. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that it cannot turn back. And I would encourage you, as we go into what could be very difficult times in the UK and in America, don't try to walk through these times without God and His hand on your shoulder. You can be a son or a daughter of God by simply entering into a personal relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, with coming to know the Son of God. The Son of God is your personal Savior, and choosing to follow Him, and He will change your life. And the God of this universe, who loves you and wants you to be His son and daughter, the God of this universe, He wants to walk through you, with you through good times or bad times. I believe we're going through bad times, and you need God on your side. You need to walk with God.
Don, I just want to thank you so much for this interview today, and thank you for your passion and your convictions, and you've inspired me. And also, if you want to get one of Don's newsletters, all you have to do is email info@revelationtv.com, and he's willing to give it wonderful insight. And I just want to thank you very much for watching Live at 9 tonight, and hopefully you've been moved and you've been stirred by what Don has had to say today. I think it's time as believers that we start getting on our knees, praying for Britain and praying for the United States, and pray for God's mercy upon our nations. Thank you, and God bless you. Bye-bye.